Why did this former school teacher, who was known to associate with abolitionists before the Civil War, become a notorious Confederate guerrilla leader responsible for one of the bloodiest raids of that war? Also, William Quantrell's allegiance to the Confederacy remains a subject of debate among historians. While some view him as a committed Southern sympathizer fighting for the cause of states' rights and slavery, some as a more opportunistic figure seeking to profit from the chaos of war, and others as a psychopathic killer. Regardless of his motivations, Quantrell quickly gained a reputation for brutality and ruthlessness. He and his followers, known as bushwhackers or raiders, launched numerous attacks on Union forces and civilian targets throughout the region, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Join me, Cory Lesmeister, as I follow Quantrell's force from its assembly area in Missouri to the ruthless attack on Lawrence, Kansas, the Raiders' escape back to Missouri, and the Union response. To understand the violence and brutality perpetrated by both sides in the Kansas and Missouri border area, we must take a brief step back. In May 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, decreeing that the citizens of the Kansas-Nebraska Territory would decide by vote to accept or reject the institution of slavery. Kansas Territory immediately became the flashpoint for the national slavery debate. Slavery opponents, called abolitionists and free staters, poured into the territory to ensure Kansas would enter the Union as a free state. Missourians all along the border actively supported the right to own slaves. The first elections in Kansas in 1855 were controlled by Missourians, many of whom crossed the border to vote. With emotions running high, talk soon escalated to violence. The next 6 years witnessed murder, looting, and revenge in an era called Bleeding Kansas. Militant abolitionists like John Brown incited violence, and notorious figures such as James Montgomery, James Lane, and C.R. Doc Jennison led raids into Missouri. Pro-slavery and revenge-seeking Missourians would retaliate and murder Kansans. When the Civil War began in 1861, many of these same militant Kansans staffed Union commands. The pretense of war enabled them to attack and pillage western Missouri. During the winter of 1861, much of western Missouri was devastated by units such as the 7th Kansas Cavalry, known as Jennison's Jayhawkers, while Lane's Brigade and Red Leg units committed murders and robberies of non-combatants. They sacked Harrisonville and burned down several western Missouri towns. In response, Missouri bushwhackers would ambush Union troops, disrupt supply lines, and terrorize Kansas towns all along the border. William Quantrill emerged as the best-known guerrilla leader, joined by the likes of Frank James, Cole Younger, and William Bloody Bill Anderson. In the summer of 1863, Quantrell's power began to wane as his former subordinates, like George Todd and Bloody Bill Anderson, split off from Quantrell to lead their own groups. However, Quantrell was a gifted leader, and on the 10th of August, he called a council of war and proposed to the other guerrilla leaders the idea to launch a raid on Lawrence, Kansas. His plan was initially greeted with skepticism. After all, Lawrence was some 40 miles behind the Union lines with a well-armed militia, and numerous Yankee units were protecting the border. In his persuasive style, Quantrell dismissed the objections and told the others,
"If you never risk, you will never gain. Lawrence is the great hotbed of abolitionism in Kansas. All the plunder or the bulk of it stolen from Missouri will be found stored away in Lawrence, and we can get more revenge and more money there than anywhere else in the state.
The next day, the council voted unanimously for the raid. On August 18th, the guerrillas, numbering almost 300, assembled on the west bank of the Blackwater River. The next morning, Quantrell led the force to the west, moving cautiously to avoid the numerous Union patrols in the area. He halted the command roughly 10 miles west of the Blackwater camp on the Benjamin Potter Farm near Lone Jack, Missouri. Benjamin Potter was a supporter of the guerrillas, so provided food and fodder as they rested here, and this was the place where for the first time Quantrell would reveal to the command the fact that they were going to Lawrence. As such, when he gathered the command together and told them that fact, he pointed out and mentioned to the troopers that they could all be massacred and overwhelmed going into the heart of Union territory. He offered the opportunity for any troopers who wanted to ride away that they could without repercussion. No one left the command. After a brief rest halt, he planned to move the command out that night. 2 weeks later, Union troops would arrest Mr. Potter, convict him of aiding the rebels, and execute him by firing squad in a nearby field. At nightfall, the raiders moved out at a fast pace. They would halt in the morning at the headwaters of the Middle Fork of the Grand River, only 6 miles from the Kansas border. Quantrell halted the command here about 0700 hours on the Harrelson farm. And somewhere in this area, Quantrell ran into the Confederate Colonel John Holt with 104 new recruits that he was taking south to join the Confederate Army. Quantrell asked Holt if he would join him on the raid into Lawrence. In addition to that, 40 to 50 guerrillas joined, bringing Quantrell's force to 450 men. It was still 40 miles to Lawrence, so in the late afternoon, the column advanced to the southwest in an attempt to slip past the Union border posts and to be in a position to attack Lawrence at dawn the next morning. So at 1700 hours, 5 p.m., on the 20th, Quantrell crossed over from Missouri to Kansas right in this area, hugging along the banks of Massacre Creek to prevent detection until he could reach the Santa Fe Trail and continue to move. Because just to his north was a Union cavalry command of 2 companies, roughly 100 men, in Aubrey, Kansas. The commander of the Aubrey detachment was Captain Joshua Pike from the 9th Kansas Cavalry. Pike responded to learning of rebel horsemen moving west by sending messengers to adjacent posts and to Kansas City, which was the headquarters of the district commander, Brigadier General Thomas Ewing. Inexplicably, Pike failed to send any warnings to the towns to the west and did not attempt any surveillance, thus allowing Quantrell to move unhindered to the outskirts of Lawrence. The rebels continued to move, passing near Gardner Junction, the spot where the Santa Fe, Oregon, and California trails diverged. Before crossing Captain's Creek, they required assistance to navigate the maze of trails, so they began abducting local citizens as guides. Whenever the guide was no longer useful, they were shot. The guerrilla lieutenant William Gregg would claim they killed at least 10 over an 8-mile distance. They would briefly halt at what was known as Keystone Corners, and the carnage would continue. So just after midnight, Quantrell and the raiders arrive here at this area known as Keystone Corners. And at the time, there were 2 houses at this intersection. One behind me at the northeast corner, and then one on the southwest corner, and actually that original house is still standing. They pause here because they are looking for someone who's on the death list, Lieutenant Andrew Jackson Jennings of the 12th Kansas Infantry. Fortunately for him, he was off on duty. However, in searching the houses, they came across a Nathan Stone. Stone had provided testimony that had led to the arrest of Captain George Todd and his father for being Confederate sympathizers. So upon finding this out, Todd goes to Quantrell and says, I want to shoot Stone. Quantrell says, no, I don't want you alerting any of the local farmers, and thus the town of Lawrence. So Todd and his associates take Stone down to the woods and using an old musket, beat him to death. Now familiar with the territory and dawn approaching, Quantrell took the lead and began to push his weary men and horses onward. At a fast trot, and then at a gallop, Quantrell would reach the highest point east of Lawrence, known as the Summit, at 5 a.m. Halting here, Quantrell ordered one of his trusted lieutenants, William Gregg, and 5 other men to scout the town. Confirming that the town was still asleep, Quantrell ordered the attack and would extract his revenge in what became known as the Lawrence Massacre. In a story with numerous twists and turns, I stumbled into one of those events that leave one scratching their head. Just to the west of the Summit was the farm of Robert Miller. The house still exists exactly as it did in the summer of 1863. After dispatching the scouts, Quantrell rode here and, posing as a Union officer, pounded on the door seeking information on Yankee troop deployment. It was well known that Robert Miller, who was not at home at the time, was an ardent abolitionist, and his house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Miller's daughter, Margaret, answered the door, recognized Quantrell, and called his bluff. Quantrell confessed to his deception and rode back to the Summit, and no harm came to the occupants or the farm. Realizing that he had achieved total surprise, Quantrell ordered the attack and dispatched a dozen troopers to Mount Oread, where the main campus of Kansas University is now located, to act as lookouts. The first victim of the raid was Reverend Snyder. He was an officer and recruiter for the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment. He sat down to milk a cow on his farm when a group of raiders peeled away from the main column and gunned him down. The next victims were 2 groups of unarmed recruits. The raiders trampled and gunned down 17 of the 22 recruits of the 14th Kansas Cavalry. Today, a small plaque on a parking garage marks the spot. The next was the 20 men of the 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry in their camp along Massachusetts Avenue. We may never know what happened to them with any certainty, as some accounts state that all were killed, while other accounts claim they all survived by fleeing across the Kansas River. We now come to the first major objective Quantrell wanted to secure: the Eldridge Hotel. This is not the original hotel, but then, like now, it dominated downtown Lawrence. The fear was that well-armed militia members would turn it into a fortress. However, the mayor of Lawrence, George Collimore, had issued orders that citizens surrender their military arms and had them locked away in the town's armory, which was across the street and is now a Starbucks. With no weapons to defend themselves, the frantic guests quickly surrendered at the suggestion of the Kansas Provost Marshal and hotel guest, Captain Alexander Banks, who implored Quantrell to protect them. Quantrell agreed and posted guards in the hotel who promptly relieved the hostages of their money and jewelry. At some point, a fire broke out in the basement, and Quantrell moved the prisoners to the City Hotel, which was his headquarters. The fire would soon rage out of control and destroy the Eldridge Hotel. Prior to the attack on Lawrence, Quantrell had issued a so-called kill list to his men. Surely at the top of that list was Senator James Lane, who lived in a house on the west side of Lawrence. Lane had raised a brigade of Kansas volunteers, which had terrorized Missouri border towns, looting and burning places such as Dayton, West Point, and Columbus. Quantrell is reported to have said on his deathbed that he planned to burn Lane alive. Lucky for Lane, he was able to flee his house and hide in a cornfield. The raid would continue for several hours, and if your name was not on the kill list, that did not guarantee your safety. What happened at the Griswold boarding house is a perfect example.
This is the site of a boarding house run by Dr. Griswold. He was renting rooms to the Thorpe family and two newlywed couples, the Trasts and the Bakers. Raiders entered the grounds, forcing the male occupants to surrender and come outside. As they were herded towards downtown, a guard opened fire, and Baker and Thorpe dropped in the street right here. Trask and Griswold ran for it and were gunned down. The Rebs now proceeded to loot the house and burn it to the ground, while preventing the women from approaching their husbands. Amazingly, Baker and Thorpe were only wounded and played dead throughout the rest of the massacre. Baker would go on to recover, but the gut-shot Thorpe would linger in agony and die the next day.
One Lawrence resident who did have a gun and attempted to fight back was George Bell. From his house, which is on the National Register of Historic Places, Mr. Bell could see the guerrillas charge into downtown, telling his wife that if the enemy were to take Lawrence, they would do it over his dead body. And with musket in hand, he ran toward the fray and was gunned down. Guerrillas would arrive at his house on Ohio Street and try multiple times to burn it down, but George's wife, Annie, would succeed in saving the house each time. By mid-morning, Quantrell began to rally his men and round up stragglers as he prepared to make his escape to the south. As the command rode away, the business district along Massachusetts Avenue was in ruins. Perhaps a fourth of all other dwellings were ablaze, and over 150 citizens lay dead, with dozens wounded. The hot August sun beat down mercilessly upon the town, casting a harsh light upon the carnage, while the smell of smoke and death hung heavy in the air, a sickening reminder of the horror that had taken place. As we follow Quantrell's trail south of Lawrence, we come to his first halt at the Wakarusa River, where he waited for William Gregg to arrive with any stragglers. From here, Quantrell could see Union cavalry approaching from the east, and future legendary outlaw Frank James let him know that he had spotted several dozen men, what he believed were Redlegs, ride into Lawrence. Once Gregg rejoined the command, it moved rapidly south, passing just east of modern-day Wells Overlook Park on its way to the small village of Brooklyn, Kansas. Union forces were now in hot pursuit. Coming from Kansas City and passing to the east of Blue Mound was Major Plum at the head of elements of the 9th and 11th Kansas Cavalry. Coming from Lawrence was Senator Lane, who, after making his escape, had put together a motley force of 36 farmers who were poorly armed, and riding mostly worn-out mules or plow horses. Perceiving the Yankee pursuit was not a threat, Quantrell decided to take the time to stop at Brooklyn and torch its few stores and homes while its 80 residents fled and hid in the fields. His next move was to advance southeast along the Santa Fe Trail, but the delay in pillaging and plunder had cost him valuable time, and he turned back to Brooklyn after catching sight of Plum's force of some 300 cavalrymen to the east. Under normal circumstances, the Confederate raiders could have blasted their way through with relative ease, but viewing his exhausted men and worn-out horses, and knowing they were low on ammunition, Quantrell decided to divert to the south, passing through the Jardin farm, where we can see the original house still exists. He moved past the Fletcher farm and then diverted back to the southeast. Meanwhile, Plum split his force, hoping to trap the guerrillas in a pincer movement as they tried to cross Ottawa Creek. The Union cavalry attacked Quantrell on the east side of the creek, but it was no match for the veteran rebel horsemen who routed their poorly trained counterparts. Once again, Quantrell turned to his trusted and capable subordinate William Gregg and gave him command of 60 men with the mission to act as a rear guard. Undeterred, the Union forces continued the pursuit as Gregg's rear guard held them at bay. The last fight of the day was at Bull Creek, where converging federal troops that could have overwhelmed the rebel force gave up the fight as the sun set. Quantrell ultimately led his force back into Missouri that evening, just a stone's throw from where he had crossed the previous day, and back into the relative safety of western Missouri. It had been a grueling and exhausting journey, but for Quantrell and his men, the mission was accomplished. Over the next several days, Union troops and militia killed several dozen of Quantrell's stragglers. However, the Union District Commander, Brigadier General Thomas Ewing, was about to become the best Confederate guerrilla recruiter of the war. The politically ambitious Ewing knew he was in trouble from the start, as he was not at his headquarters when warning arrived of the raiders' presence, but rather with his family at Fort Leavenworth. On the day of the massacre, he rode like a madman, and at nightfall linked up with Senator Lane in Missouri near the Harrelson farm. Lane made it clear to Ewing that he would be sure to level all the blame on him and would personally go to Washington and appeal to his friend President Lincoln to have him removed from command unless drastic steps were taken. On the spot, Ewing composed what would become General Order Number 11, which had been something he had been considering for some time. The order mandated the civilian evacuation of over 2,200 square miles in the Missouri counties of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and northern Vernon. The Army would grant exceptions to those near a few military posts that were known loyalists. The order gave the civilians, over 20,000 of them, only 15 days to vacate the region. The order did not specify where they were to go, only that they had to leave, and any possessions left behind would be seized or destroyed. Immediately following the raid on Lawrence, Doc Jennison would raise a new regiment, the 15th Kansas Cavalry. This unit, along with other Union forces, would enforce Ewing's order, unleashing a whirlwind of violence, plunder, and destruction that resonates in the area to this day. As one Union officer would write to his wife,
"It is heart-sickening to see what I have seen. A desolated country and women and children, some of them almost naked, some on foot, and some in old wagons. Oh God."
In Cass County, with a pre-war population of almost 10,000, only 600 would remain. All that remained of most homesteads were charred chimneys and would be called Jennison's tombstones. The devastated area would become known simply as the Burnt District. One of the victims was an 11-year-old girl named Martha Young, who, with her mother and 5 siblings, trudged behind an ox cart loaded with their few remaining possessions. The Union Army would herd them to a camp in Platte County in Missouri, where they would have to live on handouts until the end of the war. Martha would go on to marry John Truman, and their second son, Harry, would become President of the United States. She would tell anyone who was willing to listen that she felt it was a good thing that Lincoln was shot. I started this journey searching for someone of prominence, either Confederate or Yankee, to emerge as a hero, but all I found were villains, not seeking justice, but vengeance. The only heroes in this story are the unsung and untold numbers of people that struggled to survive and rebuild after the devastation on both sides of the border. The Union's effort to drain the swamp would ultimately lead to increased violence and atrocities for the rest of the war in what some have called a carnival of blood. William Clark Quantrell would see his influence fall as his former subordinates like George Todd and Bloody Bill Anderson pushed him aside. In the spring of 1865, he would lead a few dozen raiders, including Frank James, to Kentucky, where he continued his mayhem. Finally, on May 10, 1865, a group of hired guns, led by the notorious Edwin Terrell, surprised the band and mortally wounded Quantrell. Paralyzed, the 27-year-old former school teacher turned bushwhacker would linger in Louisville, Kentucky until he died on June 6th. The Union would grant pardons to the guerrillas, but many would remain unrepentant and make history of their own, like Cole Younger, Frank James, and Jesse James. But I will save their story for another day.